5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The most popular fictional Christmas story. We'll talk about what it is and why right here, next on To the Point.
To the Point, presented by Rice University.
Welcome to the Point. My name is Scott Hochberg, and we are going to do a little bit of a special program today. Not that everybody isn't doing Christmas specials. We have one of our own. We have with us Dr. Bob Patten, who is a professor of English at Rice University. He's also editor of the Studies of English Literature periodical, and is more or less the resident expert around here on Dickens. And in fact, we're going to talk about Dickens today, and one of his stories in particular, that being A Christmas Carol, which Dr. Patten tells me is the most popular Christmas story after
St. Luke.
After
I
St.
wouldn't
Luke.
compete with the Bible.
Right. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that story of all has retained its popularity and what it has to do with the Christmas season. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Scott.
And let's just get right into that. Why is a story of Scrooge, and who is essentially a miser or a very ungenerous person, why does that become the story that has survived through the years and is as popular as it is today?
Well, it is a somewhat peculiar phenomenon because you would think if Dickens needed to sit down and write a Christmas story for money, and he did need to sit down and write one, he was badly in debt, as many of us are at the Christmas season.
Or at least afterwards.
That's right, yes. Well, he didn't have credit cards. That he'd pick on something from the Bible, that he'd pick on the story of the Little Drummer Boy or of the Three Kings or something. But instead he sat down and wrote a story which gradually seized control over his imagination until he said he wept and laughed with joy as he wrote it. And it was a story about a tight-fisted old miser named Scrooge and his clerk, Bob Cratchit, who only makes 15 shillings a week, and their rather large Cratchit family, including the crippled child, Tiny Tim. That doesn't seem to have much to do with Christmas season as we know it, does it, Scott?
Not particularly. However, obviously it has at least touched some sort of theme that has kept it in the Christmas season, has kept people going back to it every Christmas.
Yes, it's it's a story, I think, that has meant many things to different generations of readers. Dickens, I think, was writing a story about conversion and wanted very much for his readers, as they followed Scrooge through the visitation of Marley's ghost and then the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and yet to come, to undergo the kind of experience and change that Scrooge undergoes. And I find that I read it every year and start out with my children feeling very Scrooge-ish, and by the end of the story feel much better toward my fellow man.
Talk a little bit about the historical context that the story was written in. In other words, what were the conditions when Dickens was writing this thing?
Well, Christmas was not much of a Christian celebration by 1843. In the late 18th and early 19th century, about all that was left was a kind of winter solstice celebration, feasting and dancing. People who have read the carol remember the great party at Fezziwig's in the second stave of the carol, which doesn't have much to do with the birth of Christ. It's just a celebration for the workers at the end of the year. And when Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, he brought over from Germany with him the Christmas tree, the Tannenbaum, and there began to be a movement toward Christianizing or re-Christianizing the Christmas season. So when Dickens' book came out in 1843, that was also the year of the first Christmas card, and people began to think about putting, as the saying goes, the Christ back in Christmas. But much of what Dickens is talking about has very little to do with the birth of the Christ child. It has to do with a change in spirit at the Christmas season, which is, of course, perhaps at the heart of the Christian story. He invents a character who is rich in worldly goods, but poor in spirit, and contrasts him to the clerk, Bob Cratchit, who is very poor in worldly goods, but rich in spirit. And the story encourages us to move from the position of Scrooge, grasping and materialistic, to the position of Bob Cratchit, who is generous and loving and hearty. But it also takes into account the fact that the Cratchit family can't continue to exist in their penury and their poverty and survive. Tiny Tim's illness or crippledness is in some vague way related to the fact that the Cratchits don't have a sufficiency of food and, warm lodging to carry on in life.
Where were we in terms of industrialization at the time in England?
England is the first industrialized economy in the West, and by the 1840s, substantial fortunes were being made by sort of second-generation industrialists. Railways were beginning, and the great railway boom goes through the 1840s. They were cutting up the landscape both in the country and the city. There were massive fortunes being made by this time, and hundreds of thousands of people toiling in factories that were pretty marginal in terms of living conditions. One of the things that concerned Dickens, as a matter of fact, in writing the Carol, was the plight of boys and girls working in the Cornish tin mines, where tiny children, 7, 8 years old, would go down into these mines on the edge of the sea in Cornwall and crawl through the shafts, dragging the loads of tin behind them. And that concern, that social concern, figures in the Carol when the Ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge throughout the whole of England on that Christmas of 1843 and shows the children laboring in the mines, among other things.
So to some extent it could be considered a social work in terms of the industrialization and the conditions that were occurring in that time.
Absolutely. And one of the problems was to try to devise a parable, to try to devise some kind of story that would deal with the increasing materialism and commercialization of a society and would still encourage people to practice Christian charity and benevolence. The turkey that Scrooge gives Bob Cratchit at the end of the story, the prize turkey and the poulterers, the gift of that turkey was criticized by the leading newspapers when the book was published on several grounds. One ground was that if Scrooge had paid Cratchit a decent wage all year long, he wouldn't have had to buy him off with a Christmas turkey. The Cratchits could have afforded one. And another line of reasoning went that Scrooge shouldn't give him a Christmas turkey because the Cratchits were poor, and if you gave the poor enough food to eat, they would simply multiply, and that would just make the succeeding generations poorer. So in a sense, Dickens got trapped trying to devise even a parable that would speak to generosity and benevolence in the midst of an industrial and materializing culture.
There's another thing that bothers me while we're talking about the turkey, and that is that after developing this entire story around the ills of material goods, that, as the term you used, was bought off, that Cratchit essentially is completely taken care of and happy, and the whole story turns around just by the receipt of this one material item.
Yes, I think Dickens tries very hard to make Scrooge's spiritual reformation convincing, particularly in the episode where Scrooge visits the future, and he sees even the hangings around his bed being stripped off and sold in a pawnbroker's shop, and he sees that nobody cares about him, and he sees his tombstone with his name, Ebenezer Scrooge, on it. And at that point he realizes that the whole tendency of his life toward the acquisition of material goods is very, very wrong, and nobody will care for him, and he begs for the Spirit to have mercy. In that context, then, his good feeling toward Bob Cratchit and others in the final stave of the Carol is supposed to represent his conversion and his open-handedness and his charity. Dickens is not naive about the need for material possessions to survive. Indeed, one of the great achievements of the Victorian period was in the area of health care, cleaning up the Thames, which was an open sewer, and things of that sort. And it's clear the Cratchits need some kind of material well-being in order to survive. If Tiny Tim doesn't get some help, the Ghost of Christmas Present says, he will die. So Dickens is trying to show that it's necessary to reform oneself and one's spirit, one's attitude first, but not entirely to give away one's worldly goods, rather to make use of them in appropriate ways to help one's neighbor.
The mechanism that Dickens uses is, of course, the ghost, the three ghosts or spirits that come forth. Why that particular mechanism? What is the significance of it? Or is it just merely a mechanism that was chosen?
Well, I think Dickens was always interested in ghosts, and indeed there's a long tradition in England of people being interested in ghosts. But these particular spirits, the ghost of Christmas past, Christmas present, Christmas yet to come, in some ways symbolize or represent memory and awareness of the present and expectations of the future, even in the way they're described, their clothing and what they bring with them. Memory is really being figured or emblemized. They also have something to do, I think, with a Christian tradition, because the Advent season, the 4 weeks before Christmas in the Church of England, is a time when the members of the congregation are urged to think about their ends, to think about where their lives are tending, and to reform now in this mortal life before it's too late. So the ghosts have a kind of Christian imagery associated with them, too, in which they point out to Scrooge the dangers of the path that he's treading. They work very effectively, I think, in psychological ways that we understand now through Freud and his disciples, because it is true that it is necessary for one to go back and re-experience the traumas of the past before one can change one's ways. That's what happens to Scrooge.
Moving from Dickens' time up to the present day, of course, the story still retains its appeal. What, as far as you can see, in the work makes it still universally applicable, other than the obvious conflicts between materialism and such?
Yeah.
What keeps it popular?
Well, I'm prejudiced, of course. I think the language is wonderful. I think it's very effective rhetorically. Edmund Wilson, who is one of the greatest literary critics we've had in America, wrote in 1939 that nobody can believe Scrooge's conversion, that we know that he's a manic-depressive type and that the day after Christmas he'll revert to being the old Scrooge. But I think for most of us who read the tale, we really somehow or other want to believe in Scrooge's conversion, want to believe that it can happen permanently, and Dickens' rhetoric encourages that. So the style, the language, seems to be one of the things that makes it perennially fresh, even though I will admit there are those purple passages that are not to our taste, though they were to the Victorian. And I think there's something fun and very funny about the ghosts, about Scrooge trying in his fright to make a joke and say of Marley that Marley's ghost is probably the product of indigestion. He says, "There's more of gravy than of grave about thee." And that humor and the ghosts and the good spirit of it in the end seem to me to appeal to us. It's been taken the wrong way, I will say. People believe that it's a story about the necessity of going down and buying more presents, and I don't really think that's what the story is about.
You talked a little bit before the show about some of the modern adaptations that you took issue with the way it was done, or you didn't like the way they were done.
Well, I do fear that they emphasize the material giving, which Dickens intended, I think, as simply as an indication, a way of talking about Scrooge open-handedness, about his generosity, his benevolence, his charity. And sometimes I think the story gets twisted into a story in which it's just sort of necessary to give presents at Christmas time, and the merchants kind of like that. There'll be a new adaptation of Scrooge out. I think it's opening sometime this week, done by a former Rice student, incidentally, former president of the SPA, Jim Bernhardt. So we'll have yet another adaptation before us soon.
Is that a play?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a musical. I've just read about it in the papers.
Okay, very interesting. A little bit off the beaten track, something we don't normally delve into literary subjects. This is supposed to be something that keeps us on top of current things, but once in a while it's nice to take a break and go back and look at something that has a little less, perhaps, political significance in the world, but not necessarily any less significance in our life. We've been talking with Dr. Bob Patten, who's a professor of English at Rice University and an authority on Dickens. We've talked about The Christmas Carol, and that's going to about wrap it up for To the Point for today, except to wish from Jean-Louis and Lee and Pam and the rest of us on the show a very merriest of holidays to all of you. I'm Scott Hochberg. Join us again next week.
To the Point is produced by Information Services in the Language Lab at Rice University.